I'm going to get right into it. We have kind of three excellent speakers today on competitiveness of regional supply chains, bringing kind of a local and actually national perspective to things, which I know, kind of as Louis Paul has said, our main focus is being on the on Hamilton, the Port of Hamilton, and Niagara region, but Hamilton is part of the Hamilton-Niagara region, part of the GTHA, and a key hub in Southern Ontario. So recognize that it's not just kind of one thing. So without kind of further ado, I'm going to introduce David Jacques from Transport Canada, who's going to talk about the components of logistics costs in Canada and kind of their breakdown. David?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Let me share my screen, or part of it. Can you guys see that okay, Ken?
Yep, we're good.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, like Ken said, my name is David Jacques. I work at Transport Canada. Part of my work involves figuring out how much is spent on logistics in Canada. So today I'll be presenting to you guys the results of this project. So yeah, what I'll start off with is by showing you the nitty-gritty details of the total logistic cost and what goes into calculating that. It's basically an accounting exercise where we collect information from a bunch of different sources. And I just want to show you what's in there, but then I'll focus most of my time on the more aggregate level, comparing the different parts to each other and how they've changed over time. And the last thing I'll do is compare these results to what other people have found when they're looking at the cost of logistics in different regions. Okay, so here it is. This is the gory, detailed view of everything. But what I want you to notice is this leftmost column. There's three broad categories: administrative, carrying, and transport costs. And those get subdivided into more detailed categories. The one thing I want to say while we're looking at this detailed view is that this information comes from a few different sources. A bunch of it comes from surveys administered by Statistics Canada. So for example, trucking for hire, medium and large carriers, that comes from a survey. Other information comes from data that's reported to Transport Canada by the ports. So this 2.8 billion for the marine ports is the amount of containers they handle multiplied by the cost of handling the containers. And still other values come from assumptions. The most notable one is administrative costs are assumed to be 4% of all the other costs added together. So if you add all of these together, multiply by 0.04, you get 7.2. That gives you an idea of what's involved in all of this and where some of the information comes from. So what I want to do next is look at these three categories: administrative, carrying, and transport cost. So in 2018, all of them added together, which is the total logistic cost in 2018, was $187.6 billion. Transport was the biggest part of that at 127.7, carrying cost were 52, and administrative 7.2 billion. And we can see how these have changed over time. We have data going back to 2004, and the most recent is 2018, which actually I got the final part of that last week. But we see, looking over time, that transport has always been, usually over 100 billion. Carrying costs around 50 billion, and then administrative costs are in the low single digits most of the time. And if we stack these three components on top of each other, we can see how each contributes to the total. And it's no surprise, transport is always a big part of it. A more insightful way of comparing these costs is looking at how each one contributes, each component's contribution to the total. So we can rescale these and look at the proportion of transport of the total, and the other two components. This violet line is the administrative cost, and it's no surprise it's a thin straight line because it's always 4%. But the interesting part to look at is this interface between the transport and carrying cost. And I'll zoom into there. So I dropped the bottom part of the y-axis. And now we see that this line between transport and carrying cost is bumpier. And it's obvious that between 2004 and 2014, transport cost as a proportion of the total was increasing. And more recently, from 2014 to 2018, that trend has reversed. So in 2004, transport costs, my numbers are here. Yeah, transport costs were 67% of the total. And then in 2014, that got up to 72%. So that's a 5% increase. And conversely, carrying cost as a proportion of the total had gone down by 5%. And we can see why this was happening if we look more closely at transport costs. So we'll just to a refresher in case you didn't memorize that first slide. Transport costs are include trucking, rail, marine, air, and freight forwarders. And these are the annual dollar value of revenues generated in each subsector from the transportation of goods. And in 2018, that's what they look like. So trucking is by far the biggest part of the transportation cost. It's almost 100 times bigger than rail, which is the next biggest. And air is tiny in comparison. It's about 100 times less than trucking. And over time, trucking has always been or often been around 90 billion or more. And the other ones have been pretty small. But these are all on different scales, and it's kind of hard to tell what's going on with all of them. So here's a rescaled value, or sorry, a rescaled version of that plot. And I use a min-max normalization. And the way that works, if we look at trucking, the minimum value occurred in 2009 and the maximum was in 2014. And everything else, all the other values fall between those two, the minimum and the maximum. And what we see looking at trucking is that between 2004 and 2014, there was an increase. All of you, I'm sure, are noticing the recession, how it affected all of the different parts of transportation. But the explanation for why transportation was taking up a larger percentage of the total can be seen by looking at trucking. It's such a big part, so it has a big effect on the transportation cost. And then after 2014, it dropped and was flat. That's why the trend, or it's part of the reason why the trend has started reversing. And the other part of the reason why is because if we look at carrying cost, these are the three parts of carrying cost. Since 2014, they haven't stopped increasing. So they dropped a lot after the recession and started going up and haven't stopped since then, whereas trucking costs have been flat since 2000, or relatively flat since 2014. So those are the three big parts and how they've changed over time. I'll talk a little bit about the total logistic costs, so when everything's added up together. So in 2018, the amount spent on logistics was 187 billion. And that's the highest it's been since 2004. And these are inflation adjusted values. And the most noticeable thing here is the recession, the last recession. Unfortunately, the data used in these calculations doesn't get updated in real time, but I suspect in a couple of years when we get data for our current recession, we're going to see a big spike, a big nosedive like we did in the last recession. Good. One thing that's interesting to look at is how the amount spent on logistics compares to GDP. So this top line is Canada's nominal GDP, and the bottom, this bottom line is the total logistic cost. It's a lot flatter on this scale. And we see that in 2018, it was 8.4% relative to Canada's gross domestic product, which is lower than the maximum, which happened in 2007. It was 9.2. So it went down after the recession and hasn't gotten back up to that 9.2% since then. And so these results, I mean, there's other people who have looked at the amount that's spent on logistics. Most notably, last time we all met, Mark presented results from his survey where he asked respondents how much they spend on logistics as a percentage of their total revenue. So his results are reproduced here in the leftmost column. In the middle, we have results from Armstrong and Associates. They calculate logistics costs for a bunch of countries, including Canada. And here are the results that I presented relative to Canada's gross domestic product. The thing that I want to point out is the totals. Armstrong and Associates and mine are pretty close. I'm not exactly sure what Armstrong and Associates is using as their source of data. They're a little bit obscure. They cite their own internal databases. So I have to dig into exactly what they're including, but they're pretty close to what I've found for the same year. But the results from Mark's survey for the Niagara region are, quite a bit higher. And we wouldn't expect them to be the same because these are really different methodologies. Mark did a survey of businesses. But even if the methodologies were the same, we wouldn't expect the results to be the same because the Niagara region probably has more economic activity in manufacturing, agriculture, whereas Canada as a whole has more economic activity in the service sector. So the amount spent on logistics in the Niagara region will be higher than it is for Canada as a whole. And the last thing I wanted to show you guys is the results from Armstrong and Associates. So they do it for a bunch of countries, and we have Canada here in red. I know it's small because there's lots of countries, but Canada is 52nd out of all these countries at 9%, and Indonesia is the top there at 22%. But if we think about it, we have to keep in mind that these are comparing very different economies. You would get a result, at the low end, if a country's all of its economic activity was in the service sector, then they would have a very low GDP versus logistic cost, whereas a country that has more mining, natural resource extraction, manufacturing would have a higher proportion of logistics costs to GDP. So when we look at it this way, Canada's not even close to the top. It's closer with these more developed countries. That's it. If anyone has any questions.
Thanks, David. As I said, I just sent along on the chat. If there are any questions, any burning ones, you can ask them now, or I can save to the end and get everyone to field the questions. Questions at the moment. Actually, I had one. I noticed that it was a kind of a trend, kind of a couple of blips. One was air costs in the last couple of years, and I was just wondering if there's a reason behind that you have any insight into.
Yeah, I think I know. I noticed it too. I didn't talk about it because there's just too much to talk about. But air. Is this what you're talking about? There's a big jump here. So this is the revenues generated by transporting cargo by air. So it has nothing to do with passengers. And I'm not sure why there's this jump, because it was pretty flat after the recession, and now things have gone up, and I expect, this year it's going to go up even more, because this is just the cargo transportation part of the carrier's revenues. But your question was why it had gone up, and I don't know why exactly. Sorry.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, if there are no further questions at the moment,